I got a brand new sweetie, better than the one before. Oh, she's got everything and a little bit more.
Hello, and welcome to Additional History Headlines You Probably Missed. I'm your host, Tiffany Clark, and this is episode 263 of the podcast. Today's episode is a mini episode. So instead of telling you about one famous event and 3 additional history stories, I'm just going to tell you about one story from history. This story is one that you may or may not have heard before. If you listen to or watch a lot of true crime stories, you'll probably know something about this. But since it's historical and fascinating to me, I'm going to tell it. Our headline of the day comes from the Bismarck Daily Tribune out of Bismarck, North Dakota. The date of the paper is June 27th, 1915. So that's the day I'm using as our episode date. That means this event happened exactly 111 years ago this week. Now, this is the part where I'm supposed to read you our headline of the day, but I'm actually going to hold off on that for a few minutes because I want to give you some background information before we get there. I'll tell you that this story is about a man named Eugene Butler. Eugene Butler was born in Niagara County, New York, around 1849. His parents were Ephraim and Rebecca Butler, and they had a pretty big family with 6 kids. Eugene was their 3rd child. Not a lot is known about his early years, but that's because nothing really stood out. It was pretty basic. He spent years working on farms there in New York, and then when he was in his early 30s, he decided it was time for a change. Eugene decided he was going to set off on his own and move out to the Dakota Territory. He had the dream, like most people who moved there at that time in history, of having his own land. This was sometime around the year 1882. Interestingly enough, Eugene attained a farm near the settlement of Niagara, this time in North Dakota. Maybe the town having the same name of his hometown area was one of the reasons he felt enticed to move to that specific area of the Dakota Territory. Who knows? North Dakota and South Dakota officially became states in the Union in November of 1889. By that time, Eugene was well established in the area. His farm was 480 acres, which is pretty big. He took great pride in farming his land, and he had a nice home. Since Eugene was single, he hired people from the nearby towns to come live out on his farm during the summer and help him with everything that is required of a farm of that size. Then, in the winter, everyone would move away, and he would endure the tough winters alone. Some sources say that Eugene never hired anyone to cook for him or to clean his house. The bachelor took care of all of his household needs himself. Other sources say that he would sometimes hire housekeepers and then complain about how much it cost. Now, people said that they liked Eugene Butler well enough. He was kind of quiet and a bit of a recluse, but he got along with everyone just fine. Of course, he was known to be a bit of a miser. People were pretty sure he had a decent amount of money, but he never seemed to use much of it. For many years, everything was fine with Eugene, but as the 1800s turned into the 1900s, and Eugene entered his 50s, things with him started to change. For the most part, he was still normal, you could say, but sometimes he would do weird things. For example, Eugene started telling people that he believed all of the unmarried women, including the widows, that lived in the area, wanted to marry him. Remember, he was still a bachelor and had never married. But suddenly he was convinced that all of the women were after him. And he had an explanation for it. He said it was because it was a leap year. I'm not sure if Eugene ever acted on it, or if he even thought it was a good thing or not, but I know nothing ever came of it. Also, I'm not sure how many women this involved, but there were about 400 people living in the Niagara, North Dakota area at this point in history. Nowadays, there aren't even 50 people there, but that's beside the point. Another weird thing that Eugene started doing was riding his horse through the middle of town in the middle of the night. People might be able to explain it away as a bad case of insomnia, except he wasn't just riding his horse. He was racing his horse at top speeds, and sometimes he would yell and shout while racing through town. It was very strange. When people asked Eugene why he was doing things like that, he told them that men would visit him late at night and tell him to get out of bed and go for long walks, or to ride his horse through town. This, of course, worried the townspeople, and I can only imagine the whispered conversations on street corners and in parlors that must have been going on. By 1904, some of Eugene's neighbors were concerned enough that they decided to do something about his behavior. Not a lot was known about mental illness back then. In almost every instance, someone suffering with mental problems was sent to live in an insane asylum, as they were called. There were certain behaviors that could make it so people could be locked up involuntarily. And one of those things was mania. And that's what Eugene's neighbors thought he was suffering from. They reported him. A board of doctors met to discuss his case, and they made a decision. They agreed that Eugene's mind was going, and they committed him to the Jamestown State Hospital for the Insane. Now, remember how I mentioned earlier that Eugene was known to be a miser? Well, when he was taken in and admitted to the asylum, he had $4,600 on him. That's a lot of money to be carrying around. But this was 1904. That's like carrying around $160,000 in cash. It was a bit crazy. He was one of the wealthiest people in the area, and his farm was said to be worth somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million in today's money. While he was locked up, a law firm in New York, probably chosen by his family that was still around, took charge of his farm, and they rented it out and hired laborers to work the land for him. Eugene got along just fine at the asylum. Not a lot is known about his time there. The staff liked him, he treated people okay, and there weren't any problems. Of course, it was the early 1900s, which meant the hospital was crowded, understaffed, and most likely provided very little actual treatment for his mental illness. But that's a story for another day. Then Eugene suddenly passed away while at the asylum. Newspapers reported that he died of phlebitis, which I think means he died from a blood clot. He was only 60 or 61 at this time. And pretty soon, notices started popping up in the newspapers that Eugene Butler's farm was for sale. But those notices came for quite some time. He died in 1911, and his body was shipped back to New York to be buried near family. It wasn't until 1915 that the farm was finally sold, and the proceeds distributed among Eugene's siblings. So far, Eugene's story has been fairly mild, right? Well, that all changed in June of 1915, when workers showed up to start rebuilding the home on the property for the new owners. And I think it's time to finally read you that June 27th, 1915 headline from the Bismarck Daily Tribune. I left it out at the beginning of the episode, but now I'm going to let you hear it. It says, "Gruesome find by workmen in old basement." Yeah, this episode is about to take a turn. It's no longer the story of Eugene Butler, but rather the story of Eugene Butler's Crawlspace. While in Eugene's old house, beginning renovations, the workers found a trap door of some sort in the floor. They opened it up, and much to their surprise and horror, I'm sure, there was a skeleton down below. The authorities were called, and they pulled the bones out from underneath the house. From the looks of it, the skeleton belonged to a male, and he was left in the crawlspace nude. There wasn't a single speck of fabric, or shoes, or even a button found with the body. Of course, the biggest question was who the skeleton belonged to. The only real identifying mark on the skeleton was that it had a crooked nose. But nobody was reported missing in that area. Had the skeleton been there for a long time, or was it recent? It seemed to be pretty old, judging by the condition of the bones, so it had to have been placed there while Eugene Butler was still alive and living in the home. And since he built the home, and people never really went inside, it was pretty clear that Eugene had put the body there. Just to make sure there wasn't anything else suspicious, the crew decided to dig around some more. And that's when the biggest shock of all came. They found another body. And another. And another. And another. And then another. One by one, bodies started to come out of the crawlspace, until there were 6 in total. These last 5 weren't accessed through the trap door in the house, but seemed to have been buried in the crawlspace from the outside so that there was more room. Upon the initial inspection, the bodies seemed to belong to adult males, and the earliest newspaper reports said things like, quote, "Bodies are those of men who worked for Butler on his farm." Could it be that Eugene had been killing farm laborers for years and then stuffing them down in his crawlspace? The people who worked for him were often transient, and people really wouldn't have missed them. If they weren't seen again, it was just assumed that they'd moved on to the next town. It's not clear if the first body was killed in the same way, but I know that the 5 found in the other part of the crawlspace all had holes in their skulls, as if they'd been stabbed in the head with something. A couple of the bodies had broken legs, probably done to make them fit in the cavity under his home more easily. Sorry about that. Just like the first body found, all 5 of the others must have been buried without clothing, because nothing was found except bones. Someone decided to call the state hospital to get a report on how Eugene had been acting since he'd been committed. But one of the doctors who worked there when Eugene was alive, a Dr. Hotchkiss, said that there wasn't anything to distinguish Eugene from the other patients he had at the time. Dr. Hotchkiss was very surprised about the news. Nobody at the state hospital would have thought it possible. Although he did admit that while there it came out that Eugene was terrified of Kodaks, meaning cameras. I assume he was afraid of all brands, but Kodak came out with their first camera not too long after he moved to North Dakota, and it was the popular choice of this time. So, why was Eugene scared of them? He believed that if anybody ever succeeded in taking his picture, he would die. He also used to tell officials at the asylum that he'd had enemies before he moved to the asylum, and those enemies had followed him there. Well, it only took a couple of days for the story being reported to newspapers to suddenly change. You see, upon further inspection, by those who knew what they were doing, it was discovered that the bones didn't belong to 5 adult males, but rather 1 adult male, and 1 adult female, and 3 juveniles. Eugene Butler didn't murder a bunch of farmhands. It looked as if he had slaughtered an entire family. The realization and news of the truth spread like wildfire across the country. The authorities believed that they'd be able to figure out who the family was before long. After all, families of 5 don't just disappear without someone somewhere missing them. But time passed, and nobody came forward with an idea of who they might be. Ever. That wasn't the case for the other skeleton, though. One man by the name of Leo Urbanski came forward. He lived not too far away in Minnesota. Leo said that many years earlier, his 5'7", 145-pound brother John had moved out to North Dakota to start a new life. John wrote home that he'd found a job working for a farmer somewhere near Niagara, North Dakota. He told them that the farmer was a bachelor. That was in 1902. And nobody had heard from John Urbanski since that date. I think most people have just concluded that the body is that of John Urbanski. Well, eventually this story changed yet again. Now, some people believed that the 5 bodies they thought were a family were actually 3 adult males, 1 juvenile male, and 1 adult female. Another place reported that there were 2 adult females. The bones really could have belonged to anyone. Now, if you're like me, your first thought is whether or not they've dug up the bones and done DNA testing, since so much can be done with that, and forensic genealogy these days. And no, they haven't done that. But it's not because people haven't wanted them to. It's because the bones no longer exist. I mentioned a minute ago that news about what was found in Eugene Butler's Crawlspace spread like wildfire. People didn't just read about the story in their newspapers days later. As soon as they heard what was going down at the old farm, they arrived in droves to get a first-hand look at everything. That part isn't the least bit surprising. It's pretty much how all crime scenes went down at that time in history. Unfortunately, all the people milling about made it so the crime scene wasn't very secure. Okay, it wasn't secure at all. People started taking souvenirs. I'm sure at first it was a finger bone tucked away into a pocket, or maybe a toe. And before long, the pieces of the skeletons were all stolen or lost. Eugene Butler's mysterious victims can't be identified because they can no longer be found. Unless somebody's great-great-aunt dies and a box of labeled skeletal parts are found in a dusty attic somewhere, this mystery will most likely never be solved. And since Eugene had been gone for 3 or 4 years before they were found, we'll never know a motive for his crimes either. Were the victims people he knew? Were the victims people who were just passing through and met up with the wrong man? Were there other victims buried on the land that just have never been found? Did Eugene kill them because they were trespassing? Because they tried to steal from him? I mean, he did have a lot of cash lying around. Or was it just because he didn't like the way they looked? Did Eugene kill them before he started losing his mind, and that's what made him go crazy? Or did he lose his mind, and that's why he killed them? Killing 5 people all at once would be a hard thing to do. Did Eugene act alone, or did he have an accomplice? There are so many questions that could be asked. But like I said, there are never going to be answers to who was buried in Eugene Butler's crawlspace unless a miracle happens. Friends, I hope you enjoyed today's mini episode. Did you know the story of Eugene's crawlspace before, or is this the first time you've heard it? Let me know. And if you haven't yet subscribed to this podcast, make sure you do that. And of course, reviews are always welcome too. If you have an idea for the podcast or want to talk about something I've already covered, feel free to reach out to me at additionalhistory@gmail.com. And remember, you can also find a video of this episode on YouTube. Then join me again in 2 weeks from today for an all-new, full-size episode. It will be about something that at least some members of my family get very excited about. I'm guessing many of you listening today will appreciate it too. But you'll have to tune in to find out what I'm talking about. Talk to you later.